Yeah, there's a lot more than 9, yeah.
The motion is opposed by Dr. Nigel Spivey, who is a teacher of classical art and archaeology at Cambridge. His books, which are many, include Songs on Bronze, Greek Myths Retold, and he has done several television series, of which one was called Digging for Jesus. Dr. Spivey.
The proposer of the motion began by saying he was putting the case for atheism. And with respect, Christopher, I'm going to start by saying this isn't a debate about the existence of God. It's a debate about us mortals, the crooked timber of humanity, and how the practice of religion in general affects us. Karl Marx famously described religion as an opiate. Jonathan Miller thinks it's more of an amphetamine, gets people overexcited, and my own meagre religious experience disposes me to think of it as a sort of anaesthetic, by which I mean that when I am in situations of feeling lonely, sad, or frightened, I find myself crooning hymns that really relate to the place where we are. They're mostly Wesleyan hymns, but anything really that has the sentiment of Psalm 23 and helps one whistle and sing through the valleys of fear and death. But I'm not here to testify as a somewhat lapsed Methodist, but instead to deliver such academic expertise as I have to offer on this topic. It's brief, has to be brief, but in my view it is so compelling that when we arrive at the conclusion in 6 minutes' time, I'm half afraid that everyone will walk out. And I'd like you to promise not to do that. Otherwise, this will be an embarrassment to the organisers and to ourselves. I'm going to talk about archaeology and anthropology and start with the news from archaeology, the long-term view. Is that better? As far as we can tell, the species of Homo sapiens roamed the world for thousands of years before becoming, as it were, religious. Something radical happened in our minds, our cognitive systems, about 40,000 years ago. We started to make things for the sake of beauty, not utility. We started painting pictures, carving sculptures. We started using symbols, and that probably included talking to each other, making music, painting our bodies, and so on. This is referred to by archaeologists as the creative explosion. And it's a consensus that there's this kind of grand collective takeoff of our human capacities in the Stone Age, or the Upper Paleolithic to be precise. And one aspect here I think I ought to highlight, which is that one of the features that appears at this time, 40,000 years ago, is that humans start burying each other properly. And they start, with these burials, to put down flowers, gifts, and other signs of what we take to be some kind of succor or consolation, and possibly a belief in an afterlife. There is some debate about whether our doomed rivals, the Neanderthals, had these sensibilities, but the consensus is that Homo sapiens is a species uniquely hardwired for metaphysics. I've written about this in an understated book called How Art Made the World, and I'm not going to go on any more about it. But this archaeological evidence for the genesis of art, religion, and culture in the creative development of Homo sapiens is not easily discounted. And it sets up an evolutionary pattern. It explains why, I think, when John Lennon or Richard Dawkins asks us to imagine a world without religion, you find your mind wandering, and you're wondering what a world would look like without King's College Chapel, without the Taj Mahal, without Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Sistine Chapel. Venice I've got down here, and I think just about all of Venice qualifies. And you become aware that even while Nietzsche in the 1880s was declaring that God was dead, at the same time you've got Van Gogh manically daubing away out of religious fervour, and a little later on, that you find Kandinsky more coolly explaining why this nexus of art, music, and spirituality made such an essential and indissoluble alliance for our quest for transcendental satisfaction. And it's why, when I'm asked to imagine a world without religion, it does tend to end up looking like, dare I say, a suburb of Swindon, with the only spire that pierces the sky is the Tesco's clock. Well, we've got a few minutes for the anthropology here as well. Once upon a time, there was a classics don at Cambridge who sat in his study, and he compiled a voluminous series of case studies gathered from around the colonized world about how pre-industrial societies kept up peculiar and primitive practices. So they cowered when the thunder started rolling, they danced for rain, they would copulate in the fields to ensure a good harvest, and so on. It's a literary masterpiece, this work by J.G. Fraser, The Golden Bough, subtitled A Study in Magic and Religion, and in Fraser's words, it set out to chart the long march, the slow and toilsome ascent of humanity from savagery to civilization. Beautifully written, but it's all tosh, and most anthropologists would say so today. In fact, it was not an anthropologist, but another Cambridge individual, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who made some remarks, offhand as it seems, about Fraser's Golden Bough, and pointed out that Fraser's method was fundamentally mistaken. Fraser supposed that savages, these so-called savages, made their sacrifice to graven idols, or they danced for rain, out of ignorance and superstition. But as Wittgenstein argued, the essence of ritual is performance, it's expressive. It's something that you can't gloss with a reasonable explanation. In Wittgenstein's word, we can only describe and say, human life is like this. Have I got time for an analogy? 1 minute, probably not time for the analogy. I was going to tell you about the risks of attempting to react violently to a computer when it does something stupid, which is based on the analogy that Wittgenstein gives of hitting the ground when you're angry. It's not because you think you're going to hurt the ground, it's because you want a release of rage. I will just briefly, incidentally say that it is a very bad idea to hit a laptop. William James, the American psychologist, showed a century ago that there is no logical connection to be made between the fact that our ancient ancestors made errors of scientific reasoning, mixed them up with their religion, and the conclusion that all religion is a big mistake. Logically, that just does not work. If I had another hour here, I'd like to expatiate on the extraordinary phenomenon of how one religion overlaps with another, and how especially the persistence of sacred behavior from the pagan to the classical world is something, the yew trees in the churches, the roots of the cult of the Virgin in antiquity, and so on. But I'm going to end up by saying that around the world, whatever we say here tonight, around the world, the sea of faith rolls on. It rolls on because faith is not some kind of atavistic relapse, but part of our creative and ingenious nature. It's a force by which we humans survive. And the conclusion is that this fact is attested archaeologically, anthropologically, psychologically, and, I dare say, neurologically. And the conclusion would be that for the next hour or so, can I tell you this? In a sense, we are wasting our time debating that we'd be better off without religion. It's not an option. Religion is part of our human makeup, and it's going to be a very interesting time that we spend, but essentially it's not a topic for debate. It's the way that we are.
Brilliant. Well done, Nigel.